bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Well, the book could actually, the chapter, and there's a lot of information piling up on my desk, and the chapter might, I don't know, but it might morph into its own book. It's starting to, the information that I'm getting and gathering. Interesting about the shots that were fired. The Warren Commission establishes that between each shot, you needed 2.3 seconds to eject the cartridge and reload and aim. And the marksman that the FBI got to fire to try to duplicate Oswald's alleged shooting is very interesting, because these are marksmen firing at a moving target in very controlled a very controlled environment. So they have everything set up. They have the tripod with the gun, and they're aiming very carefully, so on and so forth. And there's none of the, and I talk about this. I was just writing about this recently, where, and I'm going to give it a little bit away here. There was a person eating his lunch, one of the employees of the Texas School Book Depository on the 6th floor. He was eating his lunch minutes before the motorcade had arrived in Dealey Plaza, so minutes before the shooting. And I got to thinking, he didn't see anybody up there, and I got to thinking, well, okay, so you have Lee Harvey Oswald hiding in his sniper's nest that he put all those boxes around the 6th floor window to hide himself. But he's got a possible witness over there eating his lunch, so he's got to be watching him instead of watching for the motorcade, and to wait till he finishes his lunch and hope the hell that he leaves, which he did. He apparently, this employee finishes his lunch, and then he goes downstairs 5 or 6 minutes before the shooting starts. And I was thinking, well, man, that's some planning on the assassin's part. Here he is hiding behind these boxes, and there's one person on the floor. How he knew all people were going to be off that floor is beyond me, but there's one person on the floor, because if there were several people on that floor, he would have been seen.
Yeah, he would.
Right? So he's standing there watching this guy eating his lunch, and he's probably, and I'm just imagining here, thinking to himself, fuck, you got to get the hell out of here, because I got some shooting to do, right? And so, lucky for the alleged assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, he finishes his lunch, and then he goes down to the, I think it was the 2nd floor, or the either 2nd or 5th floor, to join other employees to watch the motorcade from there. And then, Lee Harvey Oswald is wiping his brow, going, oh, he's gone, so I could jump into position, takes the rifle, the motorcade comes, and he fires off 3 perfect shots. Now, it turns out that the motorcade was running late. How did the assassin know this? Did he not take into account all of this possibly happening and preventing him from jumping into position to shoot at Kennedy because there was a witness on the floor? I mean, there's all kinds of things that are just crazy. This is in the Warren report. If you were the assassin, you would be planning this a little bit more carefully. You would make sure there would be no possibility of anybody walking in and finding you. You would be in a location that is secure. You would never, I wouldn't have to worry about anybody seeing you, so you can concentrate on the motorcade arriving. But in this case, you've got this Texas School Book Depository employee on the 6th floor just eating his chicken lunch, right? And this assassin's supposed to be lurking on the same floor nearby, hiding, hoping that this guy finishes his lunch and gets the hell out of here so that I can do my shooting.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you think about it, the Warren Commission report is absolutely, and I'm going to swear here, one big fucking circus. I mean, it really is, right?
It was the blueprint for the 9/11 report.
Yeah. Oh, don't get me. We got the magic bullets in the JFK assassination. And you've got magic planes in 9/11. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. It's incredible. And you know what? It's funny in some ways, but it's a tragedy what they did to and how that affected American society. One more point I just want to add, Marcus, before you continue. I really do believe that there's a connection between the JFK assassination and what's going on right now today. And I think that was the beginning of what we're experiencing now. And I think after JFK was assassinated, there was a group of people, very powerful people, that had organized into what some are now calling a self-organizing collective to counter this force. And this was several decades in the making.
Yeah.
And I really do believe that that force is now working on our behalf with us to counter some of those forces that are going on. I don't want to get too much into that because of the censors, and I may mention a little bit of that in my book, but that's kind of sort of the angle I'm coming at.
Yeah,
from.
that's a very interesting angle, because it all does link together. If you start looking into the detail of all the major events that we've all lived through, or most of us have lived through, there are links between the way in which each event occurs and the event is investigated. It seems to follow a common pattern.
Yeah.
Whether the JFK assassination was a trial run for how do you manipulate the global population to believe one thing when something else actually happened.
Yeah.
Of course, don't forget that a few years after the JFK assassination, JFK was intimately involved in the creation of Apollo.
Yes.
We'll land a man on the moon before the decade is out and all that. So he was involved in it. If the success of the JFK assassination cover-up was seen to be successful, could that have given an impetus to the same group of people to fake Apollo? Because we've done it with JFK. We can do it with Apollo because the objective is to persuade the world that there are enemies out there and we must immediately take up arms and invade their countries. That followed in 2001, no, not 2000, 1991 with the first Gulf War. What's that about?
Yeah.
Interesting, the president at the time, or president around the time of the Gulf War, was George Bush. He's the only person on record, so far as I know, who couldn't remember where he was when JFK was assassinated.
Interesting.
He was in Dallas. He was a CIA operative at the time. Of course he couldn't.
And he was actually CIA director for a period of time too, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
It's called covering your tracks.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are so many anomalies. And of course, if you bring all these things up, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Great. So what? What difference does that make? Who am I going to defend? I'm not going to defend the perpetrators of it. I'm going to defend the people who persist in talking about it and writing about it like you're doing.
Well, I find it interesting that when it comes to the JFK assassination, there's a lot of people, they still label people who question it conspiracy theorists, but there's one very interesting new component to the assassination. That is the mainstream media. The mainstream media now is starting to sort of acknowledge that maybe there was more going on there. And, there's some murky stuff going on, some murky details. And when you and now that the mainstream media is saying that, you have people now who are calling us conspiracy theorists now saying, damn it, Marcus and Randy might have something here. And it's almost as if they needed the mainstream media to give them permission to question the official narrative.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Very good point.
And it speaks to the programming. We were all victim of it. I was a victim of it myself. I mean, all of us got caught up in the 9/11 thing. It wasn't several months later when I took another look at this and said, well, something doesn't seem right here, right? But there's still a lot of people that, years later, we're still in that mindset that, it was what the government said. And you mentioned the 9/11 report. I have that, and I am reading it.
Good luck.
And it's reading it. And there's one very glaring example of the whole investigation into 9/11. And I won't keep you too much longer. We've been talking for an hour and a half here, but
that's all right. I got all the world speaking to good people like yourself.
Oh, too kind. It just gives me, that's great. Keep talking like that and people keep buying my books. I just love it.
Quite right. You should. I'm
I
glad
hope so. It's a book I've been wanting to write for a while, and like I said, one or two of the chapters could actually morph into its own book, and so I'll have to see how that goes. But if that happens, then I'll put that book out separately.
Yeah.
But with the 9/11 thing, a lot of people don't seem to realize this. Aside from the two towers that came down that day, there was another building, Building 7, that actually came down the very same way. That was, number one, not hit by any planes, and number two, had a building in between the two towers and Building 7. So there was Building 7 here, the two towers here, and in between that is another building, but yet the Building 7 came down exactly the same way in its own footprint as the two towers. And that has never been explained. And the 9/11 Commission report decided to explain it away by not explaining it at all. So they just basically left it alone because it was, there's no way they could have explained it, right? And there's all kinds of theories as to why that building was brought down the same way. But Building 7 really is an interesting aspect to all of what happened that day.
Because if Building 7 collapsed the way we see it doing so on film, and there's plenty of film about it, not as detailed possibly as North and South Towers.
Yeah.
If Building 7 came down in that way, the only possible way it could have occurred is by deliberate demolition.
Yes.
And there's the famous comment just before that happened, when they were saying, "Oh, the fires and it's not very safe." Larry Silverstein, the investor in North and South Towers, said, "Pull it." Now, pull it is a demolition term for firing. Get it down. Pull it down. It's not a phrase you would normally use unless you knew that it had been deliberately planted with explosives, which would take some time to do it. Now, there's a very interesting example of a steel frame building which caught fire. It wasn't deliberate, it was an accident. It caught fire in London. It's called Grenfell Tower, which was a residential 22-story building.
Yes.
And it caught fire. It was an electrical fault on one of the lower floors. I think it was the 4th floor. A fridge short-circuited and it caught fire. And the whole building eventually burnt. It's a terrible thing to watch because we know there are people inside who were told to stay inside because
that happened in London. What, right? Yeah.
5 years ago in London.
Yeah, that's right. I remember. What a tragedy. Yeah.
72 people died in there.
Yeah.
They were told to stay in their apartments. It was a standard procedure at the time for the fire brigade because the buildings were supposedly not fireproof, but people could survive a fire until they were rescued. But the point is, 22 stories high, there were no tower ladders to reach that height. Anyway, the building burnt completely. It was a shell. It's still standing today. It's covered in scaffolding. It's covered in, not to support it, but to support the covering, because it reminds people in the community in which it was of what had happened. So all I'm saying is that buildings, skyscraper type buildings, all right, this is not the same size as the North and South Tower.
Yeah.
It's still a building on fire that did not collapse.
Yeah.
And to my knowledge, there is no other history of any building, steel frame building, catching fire that collapsed. It would burn, yes.
Yeah.
And what's burning is what's inside. In Grenfell Tower, it was the insulation on the outside. And there's a major court case now about who supplied it, who recommended it, who tested it, because it's demonstrated to be flammable. You surround a building with flammable material because you don't test it properly. I mean, that's dereliction of duty at the very least. It's also,
and there's other, that's a good point.
Yeah, so watching Building 7 to collapse in its own footprint because of an internal fire which wasn't consuming the whole building. There was no evidence of fire in many of the films. There's a few office fires, you know, papers, carpets, desks, that sort of thing on fire. But would that bring down a steel frame 46-story building? No, I don't think it would. And nor does anybody else think it would, because it's never happened in history before or since, except for those 3 buildings which collapsed.
You mentioned something earlier with that Building 7. I want to talk about that briefly because I was thinking of a researcher that I wrote about in my book, and you know him well. He's done some good work, and that's Emmanuel E. Garcia, who is a medical doctor with a psychiatric background. And I thought of him immediately because I would like to get his opinion on this. For those of you who are not familiar with Mr. Garcia, he's done some his own work. His papers are on the alice.com website on the Apollo moon hoax. And I talk about some of his work, and I introduce his work in the appendix section of my book. But when you were talking about the man, who was was it the owner, Silverstein? Did you mention Silverstein?
Yeah.
And he said, when he said pull it, he explains that away by saying, well, when I said pull it, I meant pull the personnel and the firefighters out. But I would wondering what Mr. Garcia would say about this, because he subconsciously that was a subconscious admission that pulling it meant the building. Because if you were saying, and if you were quick about it, you know, if you want to pull the people out of the building because we have to pull it, you would have said pull the people out first.
Or evacuate.
But he doesn't say that. He says pull it, which meant he was talking about an entity, a physical entity, not people. And I think there's a certain psychology behind how he said it. And he's tried to justify that away by saying, well, I meant pulling the personnel, but you would have said that. Pull the personnel out immediately pull the personnel out. But he didn't say that. He said pull it. He wasn't thinking of people when he said pull it. He was thinking of an inanimate object.
That's right.
And that was the building.
And if you're referring to people, you would say evacuate.
Yeah.
That's the standard way of getting people out of a building. You evacuate the people.
And he was very flippant about it when he said pull it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that piece right there, see, a detail.
Yes.
Yeah, a detail that a lot of people, it just goes over them, people's heads. It just goes over them. But I'm sure Mr. Garcia would have something to say about that. Yes, there's a certain psychology behind that. It's very revealing.
It'd be interesting to hear what he has to say on it, because he's
I would be, yes.
written very, very expressively about the Apollo missions from his viewpoint of how things work.
Yes.
How the human mind works, how it behaves, what it does under pressure. Yeah, he's contributed considerably to the debate about, was it real?
Yeah.
Was it real?
Exactly.
And now we know it wasn't, because look at the problem they're having getting back to the moon.
Oh, I know. I mean, it's incredible. And that brings me to the last point. I will probably have to wrap up soon, but I'd like you to please finish off with that thought about the moon, because I did want to bring it back full circle to the Apollo moon missions here, regarding the last. You're right. Just to finish your point about the last 50 years.
Right. So now NASA are trying to return to the moon with ladies this time, with women, and not to plant flags and collect rocks, but to conduct scientific tests and to stay for longer. That's the expressed purpose of the Artemis mission. Now, Artemis was a Greek god, or Greek goddess, who was Apollo's twin sister. Apollo was the sun god. Artemis was his twin sister, hence the Artemis program. That's why it's called Artemis. And it all sounds very good, but in order to get to the moon, you've got a rocket. You must have a rocket to do so. So what have NASA come up with? Basically, an enhanced version of the space shuttle, which is a big central tank, orange, same color as the space shuttle, with 2 solid fuel booster rockets on the side. Interestingly enough, the same technology that was developed by Jack Parsons for aircraft takeoff assists. solid fuel rockets. He was the
That's
person
right.
who,
Yeah.
as you've explained very expressively in your second book, about what Jack Parsons contributed. He was a genius in rocket design. He was the first person to be able to ensure that the thing fired and didn't explode.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they're using the same as the space shuttle. Big rocket, 4 space shuttle engines. It's called the SLS, the Space Launch System, which started life in 2004 as the Ares, ARES, Ares 5. It was the heavy lift rocket for the Constellation program, initiated by G.W. Bush, cancelled by Obama. So it had a long gestation period. It still hasn't launched yet, the SLS, the slow, late, and expensive system. It hasn't launched yet.
No.
It's been wheeled out from the vehicle assembly building.
They keep talking about it.
Yeah, wheel it out. They do what's called a wet test, where they load on all the propellants.
Yeah.
Liquid oxygen, so on, all the propellants, and they go through all the procedures to fire them, and then they shut it down. And they found that some of the valves stuck open. Well, why? Why do valves stick open? Could it be because there were moisture inside and the propellants being below freezing froze the valves? So anyway, I don't know if that's the case or not, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's been taken back to the vehicle assembly building. We're told it was supposed to launch last year. We're now told it's going to launch in August. Whether it will or not is another matter. But the point is that it's been extremely long development period, as opposed to Apollo, the Saturn V rocket, which is a similar size, in fact, even bigger than the SLS in terms of capability, in terms of launch lift weight. It just seems to be taking a long time. When Apollo, from a standing start in 1961, were on the moon 8 years later, 1969. 2004, the SLS starts its slow progress towards launch. 18 years later, we're still waiting for it to launch. It hasn't been into orbit yet.
Yeah.
It certainly hasn't been through the Van Allen belts. And it certainly has got nowhere near the moon. No human carrying rocket has ever been to the moon except for Apollo. Why? Because there are major problems. The showstopper of space is radiation, and they're gradually coming to the NASA are finally admitting that radiation is a major problem.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes, but they don't know how to deal with it.
And just what the point that you're bringing up here, and it's a very excellent point, is that NASA, within the time frame of 8 years, less than 8 years actually, but let's go with 8 years, managed to not only successfully build the Saturn 1B, but the Saturn V, which is a larger rocket, and incorporate the new never before using F1 engines, and supposedly launched, I think, a total of 13 Saturn Vs. Not within up to 1973. So I'll extend that 8 to 10 years, right? And it's very interesting that they, right now, they meaning NASA and its contractors, do not seem to have the resources or the technical know-how to just get one rocket off the ground in that same time frame. And it is actually becoming very laughable, you know, and I don't like laughing. I'm not laughing at science. Science has given us a lot, and no one's against science. You're not against science, Marcus.
No, not at all. No.
And I'm not either. But science, as I said earlier, and as you would say yourself, and you have said many times, Marcus, that science always invites questions.
Yes, by definition, science invites questions. There can be no consensus in science. If it's consensus, it's not science. It's politics.
And how often have you heard the consensus is, well, okay, that's the consensus today, but what is it tomorrow?
Yeah.
And that consensus has turned the opposite way, right? And Marcus, look at there was one subject I really wanted to get into tonight, this evening rather, or today. I'm
Yeah,
looking
go on.
outside. I don't know why I said tonight because it's still blue sky out there.
Sky
But
as well.
your involvement with and your knowledge of Scientology was really got my interest in the very beginning. We were talking about that before we started recording.
Yeah.
And I would like to save that topic, and maybe when we meet again, hopefully next month, we can maybe start off talking about your experiences with that, because that's a fascinating subject, and may have some serious ramifications for a lot of people, celebrities, society, and a good example of, may tie in with Jack Parsons and Aleister Crowley, and that's a fascinating subject that I looked at a little bit in book 2. But I definitely want to talk on that the next time that we meet. If I'm looking forward to, if you're available sometime next month.
Delightful. Yeah, very happy to do so, because it's a subject which people find interesting.
Yeah.
Fascinating in some respects, but I've had personal experience of the operation of it. I'm no longer a part of it. 30 years ago, I left. Always asked to leave, but that's another story. So it's a very interesting understanding how that sort of operation works, how it operates, how it controls its followers,
Yeah.
who the charismatic leader is. All very interesting, very, very relevant to today.
Yeah,
So,
no, and I think we should actually get into that and talk about that. That'll be our first topic.
Yeah.
Will be on Scientology.
Jack Parsons, JPL, it's not called the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, it's Jack Parsons Laboratory.
Yeah.
Aleister Crowley, they were all involved with the founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard. They were all involved. He was around at the time, and his story is a fascinating story as well.
It's absolutely fascinating, and it's very interesting how it ties in with not only NASA, but the subject of the Beatles. It ties in with the Beatles, other famous groups like Led Zeppelin. They were all followers of Aleister Crowley, the occult. And Aleister Crowley is, he's a Satanist. He's a self-professed Satanist.
Yeah.
And there were several names that were applied to him. We can get into that part later, but it's very interesting how it all ties in with the agenda in the last 50 years. Music, the music industry, celebrities, movies, Hollywood, all of it. So your insights into this, I think people will be very interested in hearing your insights into Scientology and the effect that it has had on society as a whole. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion.
There's also one area that maybe should be included in that list of people that you just said, is the intelligence community, the military and political intelligence community. And that was first examined very effectively by Dave McGowan.
Yes.
On the story that he told of the famous road in north of Los Angeles called Laurel Canyon.
He wrote a book on that, right?
Well, I don't know if it was a book. It's certainly on his website.
He wrote a book. I remember the book. I think I remember. In fact, I remember the book. I'll look it up, but I think it's on Amazon for people. Certainly go check it out. I think he has a book out. It came out years ago, and talking about exactly what you just mentioned, Laurel Canyon, and the music industry, and how everything was. A lot of these bands were really manufactured, an extension, as you just said. American intelligence agencies.
Yeah, because the intelligence agencies used the youth movement, which was a construct, to create the environment for political change to take place.
Exactly.
And the major center of the music industry in the United States was centered around Laurel Canyon. That's where most of the major musicians at the time lived. Including people like Frank Zappa and the Mamas and the Papas, who were all big groups around the 60s. So the links between the intelligence, and they all had links with the intelligence community. I mean, whether they were fathers or the families were involved. I mean, one example has always been Jim Morrison of The Doors.
Yeah.
His father Jim Morrison's father was Admiral George Morrison, who was commander of the USS Maddox, which was allegedly attacked at the Gulf of Tonkin. It wasn't, I say allegedly because it wasn't attacked. There were no North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacking the American fleet. It was a deliberately created lie, for want of a better word, to enable America to enter the Vietnam War. So that there are, now, I'm not saying Jim Morrison had anything to do with it. I'm just saying his father was involved. Yes, he was not. He was quite deliberately not involved. He went another way through the music. Now, the Beatles, you say, they stayed in Laurel Canyon. They didn't live there. They rented a house there for a short while. But many of the major musicians of the early 1960s were connected with and had access to Laurel Canyon and what was going on there.
And how many people know that, Marcus? Not very many. And when the great example, of course, as you just mentioned, is Jim Morrison. And a lot of, when I found that out myself, I was, whoa, if this isn't, the connections, it's so connected. There are connections that we don't know about, probably can't even comprehend right now. But that one is a blatant example. Jim Morrison is tied to the person who's responsible for getting the United States into a war with North Vietnam based on a lie.
Yeah.
Wow. Incredible, isn't it? I look forward to this conversation. I really do.
Oh, there's plenty to talk there. Plenty to talk.
There is.
Sure, there are people who will have been connected with the Scientology cult for a while who will be interested to hear what I have to say.
I think they will. I'm pretty sure a lot of people will be interested. It'd be a very interesting subject. Marcus, I just want to thank you. I'm going to stop the recording soon, but hang on. I just want to chat with you after that. But I just want to thank you. Excellent, very enlightening discussion as always with you.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate you coming on here. And I look forward to another discussion. And we start off with Scientology next month if you're available.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Always pleased to do it. And it's always lovely to chat to you, Randy. Really, really look forward to it as well. Because you ask such good questions. You elicit good information.
That's how I get the answers, Marcus. It's all in the questions, right? And I find that you have a lot of answers to the questions I ask. So that's why I just love having you on and discussing this. So as I tell everybody, you're a wealth of information. And again, I just appreciate you coming on here. And I look forward to discussing this, continuing this discussion next month.
Thank you. Look forward to it.
Okay. All right, so everybody, we'll see you again next month. And for now, we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.
Like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line from